In the dimly lit chambers of medieval hospitals, where prayers echoed louder than the sound of scalpels, doctors believed illness was a punishment from God. Bloodletting, leeches, mercury, and superstition, these were not the remedies of madmen, but the trusted science of their age. Tonight, as you close your eyes, let's drift back to a time when medicine meant mystery and healing often meant harm. This is Sleeping History. The Age of Superstition. In medieval Europe, between the 5th and 15th centuries, medical practice was not based on science, but on belief. Belief in divine will, astrology, and the ancient writings of long-dead philosophers. Doctors studied the works of Galen and Hippocrates, men who lived over 1,000 years earlier, and rarely questioned them. The Church controlled medical learning, and to doubt Galen was almost to doubt God himself. A patient's illness was often seen as punishment for sin. Instead of diagnosis, priests and physicians prescribed prayers, holy water, and confession. When treatments failed, and they often did, it was never the doctor's fault, but the patient's lack of faith. At the heart of medieval medicine was a theory called the four humors. According to this idea, the human body was made of four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To stay healthy, these fluids had to remain perfectly balanced. Fever, too much blood. Sadness, too much black bile. So to restore balance, doctors used leeches or blades to draw out blood, sometimes until the patient fainted or died. Bloodletting became so common that even barbers performed it. The red and white striped barber pole we still see today? It's a relic of that bloody profession. Medieval hospitals were not places of recovery, they were places of refuge and death. Often run by monks and nuns, these hospitals were more like hospices for the dying and poor. Cleanliness was considered unnecessary. Infection was misunderstood. A surgeon might use the same knife on multiple patients, never washing it. Anesthetics were unheard of. Instead, patients were given alcohol, opium, or prayers. The smell of blood, rot, and candle wax filled the air. In this world, even surviving surgery was a miracle. The Black Death and the failure of medicine. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing over a third of the population, doctors were powerless. They wore strange bird-like masks filled with herbs, believing the plague spread through bad air. Some recommended bathing in vinegar. Others blamed the stars. A few even accused minorities or witches. Their ignorance turned a medical disaster into a social catastrophe. Surgeons and butchers. Surgeons were considered lesser men, often grouped with barbers and executioners. They worked with their hands, while university-trained doctors looked down on them. Without anesthetics or antiseptics, surgery was brutal. A leg amputation had to be done in under 2 minutes, using a saw and raw strength. Patients screamed, bled, and often died from infection, not the wound itself. Bloodletting and the myth of cure. Bloodletting was believed to cure almost everything: fever, headache, even mental illness. But instead of healing, it weakened the sick. Some records show patients losing several pints of blood, nearly fatal. Ironically, the few who survived were often strong enough to recover naturally. Doctors mistook coincidence for cure. The Church's grip on science. The Church taught that the body was sacred and should not be dissected. This prevented progress in anatomy for centuries. Medical students could only study from ancient books, never from real corpses. Those who tried to learn from human dissection risked excommunication or worse. Only in secret, some brave scholars began to study real bodies, uncovering the truth that ancient texts were wrong.
In a world ruled by fear, religion, and ignorance, the most effective healers often lived on the margins, far from universities and churches. These were the wise women, herbalists, and cunning folk of medieval Europe. They had no degrees, no Latin books, and no blessings from bishops, yet their patients often trusted them more than any physician. A medieval doctor might prescribe bleeding or mercury for a fever, but an herbal healer would reach for willow bark, the natural source of aspirin. They studied plants by touch, taste, and experience, passing down knowledge through whispered generations. Many of these healers were women, working quietly in villages. They gathered herbs at dawn, believing the morning dew held power. They used lavender for calm, chamomile for pain, garlic for infection, and honey to heal wounds, remedies that modern science now recognizes as effective. But in the eyes of the Church, such women were dangerous. Healing outside divine authority looked suspicious. If their patients recovered, people whispered, "She must have used magic." As the centuries passed, superstition grew darker. When the plague came, when cattle died, or when a storm destroyed crops, people searched for someone to blame. And the women who healed, those who worked with herbs and spoke of nature, became targets. By the late Middle Ages, the line between healer and witch had blurred. Many witch trials began with accusations of forbidden healing. The same hands that once healed were now burned as servants of the devil. Yet their legacy survived. Much of today's herbal medicine and natural healing owes its roots to these forgotten figures, the quiet scientists of the Middle Ages, working in secret, in defiance of fear. While peasants trusted herbs and prayers, scholars and dreamers turned to a different kind of magic, alchemy. In candlelit laboratories, alchemists mixed metals, potions, and gases in search of a single goal, the philosopher's stone, a mythical substance said to turn lead into gold and grant eternal life. But alchemy, for all its mysticism, was the spark that lit the fire of modern science. Medieval alchemists recorded their experiments in coded languages, filling books with strange symbols and allegories. They were mocked by priests and feared by kings, yet their obsession with transformation changed how people saw matter itself. One of the earliest known alchemists, Albertus Magnus, was both a monk and a scientist. He experimented with minerals, metals, and plants, seeking not just wealth, but knowledge. He believed nature held divine secrets that could be revealed through observation, not just scripture. Though most alchemists failed to create gold, they discovered acids, distilled alcohol, and learned to purify substances, the foundation of chemistry. Distillation, fermentation, and crystallization all came from alchemical experiments. But alchemy was more than science. It was philosophy. It spoke of inner transformation, turning the lead of ignorance into the gold of wisdom. In a strange way, the alchemist's journey mirrored humanity's own, from darkness to enlightenment. By the 15th century, the Church began to tolerate certain forms of alchemy, especially those that promised to create medicines. The alchemists slowly evolved into apothecaries and chemists, and the mystical art became a rational science. When you hold a bottle of medicine today, you hold a fragment of that ancient dream, born in the smoky rooms of medieval alchemists who dared to ask, "What if the world can change?" How Arab medicine changed everything. While Europe sank into superstition, the Islamic world was experiencing a golden age of science and healing. From the 8th to the 13th century, cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba became centers of knowledge, filled with libraries, scholars, and hospitals that were centuries ahead of their time. Arab physicians translated and expanded upon the works of the Greeks, preserving knowledge that Europe had forgotten. One of the greatest among them was Avicenna, Ibn Sina, whose canon of medicine became the most influential medical text in the world for over 500 years. He wrote about contagious diseases, mental health, and the importance of clean air and water, ideas that Europe wouldn't rediscover until the Renaissance. In these hospitals, patients were treated with respect, cleanliness, and care. Doctors studied anatomy through observation, kept detailed records, and separated wards by disease type, practices unheard of in Europe at the time. Another great figure, Al-Razi, or Razis, wrote about smallpox and measles, describing their symptoms with scientific precision. He emphasized that a good doctor must use logic and evidence, not superstition, to find the truth. When European scholars finally came into contact with this knowledge, often through the Crusades or translations in Spain, they were astonished. For the first time, medicine became more than ritual. It became science again. Arab medicine didn't just save lives, it revived the very idea of learning. It reconnected humanity with reason and observation, the same tools that would later ignite the Renaissance. Without the brilliance of these scholars, the dark age of medicine might have lasted centuries longer. The Renaissance rebirth of knowledge. The dawn of the Renaissance was not sudden. It began as a flicker, a whisper of curiosity that spread across Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. After centuries of religious dominance and blind faith, humanity began to rediscover something extraordinary, the value of reason. Artists painted the human body with precision, philosophers questioned old truths, and in the universities of Italy, France, and England, scholars began to study medicine not as theology, but as science. At the heart of this rebirth was Andreas Vesalius, a young Flemish anatomist who dared to dissect human corpses, something forbidden for centuries. His masterpiece, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, shattered ancient dogma. For the first time, doctors could see the real structure of the body, not the imagined one described by Galen. The Renaissance also brought a shift in how society viewed disease. Illness was no longer just divine punishment. It became a natural process, understandable and treatable. Hospitals improved. Surgeons used anatomy drawings to plan operations. The printing press spread medical knowledge faster than ever before, a revolution of information that changed the world. For the first time, medicine was not chained to religion, but inspired by observation, art, and the beauty of truth. The human body, once feared and sacred, became a subject of study, a masterpiece of nature waiting to be understood. The Renaissance didn't just heal the body, it healed the human mind.
The first human dissections. For much of the Middle Ages, dissecting a human body was considered blasphemy, a sin against God's creation. But by the late 15th century, this taboo began to crumble. In hidden rooms lit by flickering candles, surgeons and students gathered around the lifeless form of a criminal or pauper,
ready to unveil the secrets within. The first public dissections were shocking events. Crowds came not only for learning, but for spectacle. Professors read aloud from Galen's ancient texts, while the barber surgeons cut the flesh. And to everyone's surprise, the body often did not match the book. Each cut revealed truth, muscles layered with precision, veins like rivers, organs placed not by divine mystery, but by design. These early dissections gave rise to a new science, anatomy. They revealed how the heart truly worked, how bones connected, and how the brain linked to the body. This knowledge reshaped surgery, medicine, and even philosophy. Yet, it was dangerous work. Many dissectors were accused of heresy. Some stole bodies from graves, leading to the rise of body snatchers, men who supplied corpses for study in secret. By risking their lives, these early anatomists changed history. They transformed medicine from belief to knowledge, from faith to fact. Their legacy remains in every anatomy book, every surgeon's hand, and every heartbeat we understand today. Pain, death, and the birth of surgery. Before anesthesia, surgery was horror. Every operation was a battle between life and unbearable pain. A leg amputation might take 2 minutes, a tooth extraction 30 seconds, but the agony seemed eternal. Surgeons worked fast. Assistants held patients down as knives cut, saws screeched, and blood poured. The only comfort was alcohol, prayer, or fainting from shock. But these brutal experiences pushed surgeons to become faster, cleaner, and more precise. They learned to tie arteries with silk instead of burning them with hot iron. They discovered how to clean wounds with wine or vinegar, unknowingly killing bacteria. One of the greatest pioneers was Ambroise Paré, a French barber surgeon in the 16th century. He rejected boiling oil for gunshot wounds, a common treatment, and instead used a simple balm of egg yolk, rose oil, and turpentine. To everyone's surprise, his patients healed faster and suffered less. Paré also invented prosthetic limbs and surgical instruments still recognized today. He transformed surgery from butchery to craft, guided by compassion as much as skill. The operating room was still a place of terror, but thanks to Paré and his successors, it became a place where science, not suffering, began to rule.
Blood and belief, the birth of anatomy. In the 17th century, Europe's thirst for discovery reached its peak. The printing press spread medical illustrations, universities multiplied, and a new invention, the microscope, opened an unseen world. One man changed everything, William Harvey. In 1628, he published De Motu Cordis, on the motion of the heart and blood, proving for the first time that blood circulates through the body. Before Harvey, doctors believed the liver created blood and the body used it up. But Harvey showed that the heart acted as a pump, sending blood through arteries and returning it through veins. It was a revolution. His discovery faced ridicule at first, but over time it became the foundation of modern physiology. For the first time, medicine could measure, predict, and explain the inner workings of life. This era also saw anatomy theaters rise across Europe, architectural marvels where students watched dissections from tiered balconies. The human body was now public knowledge, no longer divine mystery. The union of science and anatomy marked the end of medieval superstition. Medicine had finally entered the modern world. Superstitions and cures of the plague. Even as science advanced, the shadow of the Black Death still haunted Europe. From the 14th to the 17th centuries, waves of plague returned, wiping out entire towns. Doctors tried everything. Some burned herbs, others carried posies of flowers in their masks to protect against bad air. Quarantines were invented. Ships arriving in Venice had to wait 40 days before docking. 40 giorni, the origin of the word quarantine. But superstitions still thrived.
People believed plague came from sin, from the alignment of planets, or from poisoned wells. Flagellants whipped themselves in the streets to seek forgiveness. In some towns, innocent minorities were blamed and massacred. Yet through tragedy came innovation. City governments began to record deaths, track infections, and enforce sanitation. For the first time, public health became a duty of the state. The plague taught Europe the importance of cleanliness, isolation, and data. Lessons that one day would stop cholera, smallpox, and other killers. Out of death came discipline. From superstition came science.
Long before the Renaissance, Europe's first universities were born: Bologna, Paris, Oxford. In dim lecture halls, students listened to masters read ancient texts aloud in Latin. There were no cadavers, no experiments, only words. Yet these schools laid the foundation of academic medicine. The University of Salerno in Italy, founded in the 9th century, was the jewel of medieval medicine. It accepted women, taught from Arab and Greek sources, and focused on healing rather than mysticism. Salerno's doctors emphasized diet, exercise, and hygiene, revolutionary for their time. They wrote Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, a guide on healthy living that spread across Europe. Eat in moderation, it said, sleep well, and avoid anger. Simple wisdom that still holds truth today. These medieval universities bridged superstition and science. They created physicians who, while still limited by old theories, began to think critically. Their legacy survives in every modern medical school. Doctors of the Church and Science. The relationship between faith and medicine was always complex. Many monks were skilled healers, tending to the sick with herbs and compassion. Monasteries often had gardens filled with medicinal plants, lavender, mint, sage, and rue. Yet the Church sometimes silenced innovation. When science challenged Scripture, it was seen as heresy. But even within the Church, there were thinkers who saw no conflict between God and reason. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, wrote texts on natural healing, music, and theology. She described the human body as a reflection of the cosmos, a balance of elements, spirit, and nature. Her writings influenced both science and spirituality. Later, Christian physicians like Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus argued that observation and experiment were paths to understanding God's creation. They paved the way for Galileo, Newton, and the scientific revolution. Thus, even from within faith, the seed of science grew, nurtured by those who dared to see divine order in nature's laws. The great medical reformers. By the 18th century, medicine was transforming fast. The microscope revealed cells and microorganisms. Hospitals became organized institutions, and pioneers began challenging centuries of false beliefs. Edward Jenner discovered vaccination in 1796, using cowpox to protect against smallpox, the first real victory of preventative medicine. Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1840s showed that washing hands saved lives, though his warnings were ignored. Florence Nightingale brought hygiene and compassion to war hospitals, turning chaos into care. These reformers fought ignorance, tradition, and ridicule. They saved millions by embracing evidence over ego. The spirit of the Renaissance, curiosity, courage, and compassion found its champions again. Medicine was no longer a mystery of blood and belief. It had become a science of observation and humanity.
By the 19th century, the ghosts of the Middle Ages were fading. Doctors now used microscopes, antiseptics, and anesthesia. Pain could be conquered. Infection could be stopped. The discovery of germs by Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch revealed the true cause of disease: invisible life forms, not sin or imbalance. Surgeons like Joseph Lister sterilized their tools, saving countless lives. Hospitals became places of healing, not death. In less than a century, Medicine advanced more than in the previous 1,000 years. The world had stepped fully into the light of science. Yet the echoes of the past remained. The rituals, the herbal cures, the fear of the unknown. They remind us of how far we've come and how fragile progress can be. Legacy of pain, what we still carry today. Today, when you walk into a hospital filled with machines and monitors, it's easy to forget how dark the journey once was. But the medieval struggle between faith and science, fear and curiosity, still shapes us. We still seek miracles. We still question what we don't understand. We still balance between hope and reason. The medieval doctor, the herbal healer, the alchemist, they were all driven by the same desire: to understand life, to ease suffering, to touch the unknown. Their mistakes were terrible, their courage immense. Every pill, every vaccine, every modern surgery carries a trace of their story. And so, when you close your eyes tonight and drift into sleep, remember, the path from darkness to light was carved by hands trembling in faith, guided by curiosity, and illuminated by pain.
In the narrow streets of late medieval cities, the smell of crushed herbs and heated oils drifted from wooden shutters. Inside, behind counters stacked with jars of powders and dried leaves, worked the apothecaries, ancestors of the modern pharmacist. They were not physicians, yet they understood mixtures better than most doctors. Their benches were covered with mortars, pestles, scales, and strange glass vessels. They measured, ground, distilled, and mixed. From cinnamon, myrrh, and mint, they made soothing balms. From sulfur and saltpeter, they prepared medicines, and sometimes poisons. Apothecaries stood at a curious crossroads of science and commerce. They learned from Arab recipes translated through Venice, from herbal guides printed in Latin, and from the stories of travelers who returned from the East. Each city had a guild: London's Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, Florence's Specieri, Paris's Maître Apothicaire. They trained apprentices for years before allowing them to sell on their own. People trusted them. A mother came for sleeping syrup, a soldier for wound salve, a nobleman for rosewater and perfume. Behind the counter, the apothecary listened, asked questions, and prepared his draught with ritual precision. A little too much of one powder could heal or kill. As the centuries passed, apothecaries began to record their recipes. These books, part science and part art, became pharmacopoeias, the first standardized manuals of medicine. Their attention to quantity and evidence quietly undermined superstition. By the 17th century, physicians often complained that apothecaries stole their patients. In truth, they were transforming medicine from mystical to measurable. They were the chemists of compassion, balancing the line between alchemy and reason. Small shops of light in cities still shadowed by ignorance. Anatomy theaters and the spectacle of the body. By the early modern age, Europe's curiosity about the human body had turned into public fascination. In cities like Padua, Amsterdam, and Leiden, great anatomy theaters rose, circular halls shaped like temples of knowledge. Students, nobles, even curious citizens crowded the wooden galleries. Below them, on a marble table surrounded by candlelight, lay the silent form of a condemned criminal. The professor, dressed in black robes, recited Latin, while the dissector carefully opened the body. The smell of preservative herbs and wax filled the air. These were not merely scientific events, they were theater. Musicians sometimes played, painters sketched the exposed organs, philosophers debated the soul. To witness the body opened was to confront mortality itself. The most famous theater stood in Padua, where Andreas Vesalius's influence still lingered. Here, doctors could finally compare theory to reality. the heart, the lungs, the network of veins. They were not divine mysteries, but living machinery. In time, the theater became a symbol of transparency, knowledge laid bare like the flesh before the scalpel. But it also raised moral questions. Could education justify desecration? Could curiosity exist without cruelty? From these candlelit chambers emerged generations of surgeons who understood anatomy not as sin, but as truth. The anatomy theater was Europe's mirror, showing both brilliance and brutality. Within its wooden rings, the modern idea of scientific demonstration was born. The dawn of microscopes.
In the 17th century, curiosity shrank its gaze. Where once men searched the heavens, they now peered into drops of water and fragments of flesh. A simple glass lens, polished and curved, opened a new universe. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch cloth merchant, ground his own lenses and created the first powerful microscopes. Through them, he saw what no human had ever seen: tiny animalcules swimming in rainwater, blood cells pulsing, mold spreading like forests. At first, scholars laughed. They accused him of illusion. But Leeuwenhoek's detailed letters to the Royal Society in London forced belief. The invisible world became undeniable. The microscope changed medicine's direction. Diseases were no longer mysteries of the stars, but battles of living creatures. Though germ theory would come much later, the seed was planted. The scale of wonder shifted from the cosmic to the microscopic. Craftsmen refined the lenses. Artists drew what they saw. Doctors began to collect specimens. A single drop of blood could now tell stories more precise than any horoscope. The microscope taught humility. It reminded humanity that power lies not only in what is vast, but in what is minute. In every mote of dust, in every cell, the medieval world's belief in divine mystery began to dissolve into scientific awe. By the 18th century, Europe's cities were swelling with people, and disease traveled faster than prayer. Out of necessity, medicine turned outward, from individual souls to entire populations. Thus was born the age of public health. Hospitals, once monastic refuges, became civic institutions. Paris built the Hôtel Dieu anew. London opened St. Bartholomew's and Guy's. Vienna, Berlin, and Madrid followed. Architects designed wide corridors for air and sunlight. Nurses, many trained under religious orders, cared with both discipline and tenderness. Statistics emerged, numbers that revealed truth more clearly than sermons. Governments began to record births, deaths, and causes of illness. Physicians like John Grant analyzed data to find patterns, predicting epidemics before they struck. Quarantines were enforced, sewers built, and clean water systems planned. The smell of decay that had haunted medieval streets slowly receded. Public health was not merely a system, it was a philosophy, the belief that every life, rich or poor, deserved protection. It required cooperation between doctors, city councils, and ordinary citizens. The transition was not smooth. Hospitals overcrowded, funding faltered, and class differences persisted. Yet for the first time, society saw disease as a shared enemy. The city itself became a patient, and medicine its conscience. From the chaos of plague-ridden towns arose the first heartbeat of modern civilization, an organized compassion written in stone, soap, and statistics.
The Enlightenment and the Human Machine. The 18th century called itself the Age of Reason,
and medicine answered with anatomy, chemistry, and philosophy combined. If the Renaissance rediscovered man, the Enlightenment sought to understand him. Thinkers like René Descartes described the body as a machine, an intricate system of levers, fluids, and impulses. While theologians feared this reduction, scientists embraced it. To know the machine was to repair it. Physicians conducted controlled experiments. Electricity, newly harnessed, was applied to paralyzed limbs to make them twitch. It seemed proof that life itself was a current. Chemists analyzed air, identifying oxygen and its role in breathing. Mathematicians used numbers to explain pulse, temperature, and pressure. Hospitals became laboratories. Observation replaced superstition. Even pain was studied, not as punishment, but as signal. Yet the Enlightenment also brought arrogance. Some doctors began to see patients as mere subjects, forgetting empathy in pursuit of precision. The human heart was measured, but not always heard. Still, this century of reason built the foundation for modern medicine. Anatomy mapped, chemistry clarified, surgery refined. The dream of the alchemist to turn ignorance into knowledge was finally being realized, not through gold, but through understanding. And so the human machine, once shrouded in mystery, began to reveal its gears. In the quiet hum of laboratories and the rustle of hospital sheets, a new kind of faith was born, not in miracles, but in mind.
In the twilight of the 17th century, when science began to define itself against superstition, a few stubborn dreamers still guarded the fading fire of alchemy. Their laboratories glowed at night, small temples of glass and smoke, where men with ink-stained fingers whispered prayers to Mercury and fire. They were not fools, though history remembers them as such. They were the bridge between magic and method, between divine mystery and measurable truth. In dusty manuscripts, they wrote of transformation, not only of metals into gold, but of ignorance into wisdom. To them, the crucible symbolized the human soul, impure, flawed, yet capable of refinement through suffering and heat. Figures like Isaac Newton, celebrated as a scientist, spent more hours studying alchemy than physics. He believed that matter itself held secrets of God. And Paracelsus, the wandering physician of the 16th century, had declared that medicine and alchemy were sisters, both seeking the hidden essence that healed or harmed. But by the 18th century, alchemy faced its quiet death. The scientific method demanded proof, not prophecy. Glass retorts gave way to calibrated instruments. Faith gave way to formula. Yet the legacy remained. Alchemists had invented techniques that chemists would perfect: distillation, extraction, crystallization. Their poetic language, the marriage of sulfur and mercury, the purification of the prima materia, would become the dry terminology of modern chemistry. In the flickering candlelight of their laboratories, one could still sense a strange beauty. Alchemy had failed to make gold, but it had turned wonder itself into an element of science. The last alchemists died not as madmen, but as visionaries whose dreams transmuted into discovery.
Before the 19th century, surgery was a profession of bravery rather than science. Surgeons worked in blood-stained aprons, often in the same clothes they wore to dinner. There were no antiseptics, no anesthesia, only speed and courage. Amputation was measured by the ticking of a pocket watch. Patients bit leather straps or drank themselves into oblivion. The smell of rot and iron filled the air. Yet in these brutal rooms, the first modern surgeons were born. In London, John Hunter dissected bodies by candlelight, mapping the human form with obsessive care.
In Paris, Guillaume Dupuytren refined surgical instruments and demanded precision. In Scotland, James Syme trained a generation of doctors who valued clean technique over superstition. Then, in 1846, the miracle arrived: ether anesthesia. For the first time, pain could be silenced. When the surgeon raised his knife, the patient slept. Crowds wept in operating theaters. It was as if mercy had entered medicine. A few decades later, Joseph Lister introduced antiseptics, washing wounds with carbolic acid. Death rates plummeted. What had been a gruesome craft became a discipline of cleanliness and care. By the end of the century, the surgeon's mask replaced the butcher's apron. The scalpel became an instrument of hope, not horror. Hospitals grew quieter, brighter, more humane. Surgery had crossed the threshold from suffering to salvation. The blade that once symbolized fear now represented precision, the human will to heal, refined by courage and guided by science.
The invisible killers. Even as surgery advanced, invisible enemies still ruled the world. Plague, cholera, and typhus struck with vengeance. Doctors washed their hands in blood, but not in water. The 19th century demanded a new kind of vision, one that could see what the eye could not. That vision came from men like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Pasteur, working in France, discovered that life did not arise from decay. It came from living organisms too small to see. He boiled broths, sealed flasks, and proved that air carried invisible spores. He called them microbes, and medicine was never the same. Koch, a quiet German doctor, went further. He stained bacteria with dyes, watched them multiply, and identified the culprits behind anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera. Each disease had a name, a face, and therefore a weakness. With germ theory, hygiene became sacred. Hospitals began to sterilize. Doctors washed their hands, and cities built clean water systems. The age of invisible killers was ending. But the struggle was not only biological, it was philosophical. For centuries, humanity had blamed demons, miasma, and divine punishment. Now science revealed a simpler, colder truth. Disease was not moral, but mechanical. That realization brought humility. It also brought responsibility. If sickness had natural causes, then so did healing. The world could be improved, not by prayer alone, but by understanding. The invisible had finally been seen, and knowledge itself became the new vaccine. The industrial body. The 19th century roared with steam, iron, and ambition. Factories replaced fields, and the rhythm of life changed from the toll of church bells to the hiss of machinery. Bodies, too, became part of the machine. Children worked 12-hour shifts. Men and women inhaled soot and smoke until their lungs hardened. Doctors began to notice new kinds of illnesses: industrial diseases, phossy jaw among match girls, black lung among miners, and lead poisoning in painters. The human machine was breaking under its own invention. Yet from this suffering arose a new medical awareness. Governments passed factory laws. Reformers demanded inspections. Public health evolved from a moral duty into a political necessity. Hospitals began to serve the working class, not just the rich. Doctors published reports with grim illustrations of diseased lungs and bent spines. The microscope and the stethoscope became tools of justice as much as science.
Meanwhile, medical technology advanced alongside industry. Stethoscopes, Thermometers and blood pressure gauges became standard instruments. The first X-ray machines hummed with electricity, revealing the bones beneath skin. The industrial age reshaped medicine in its own image, precise, efficient, and often merciless. Yet amid the noise and progress, the physician's role remained the same: to defend the fragile human body against the world it had built. And so, as smoke rose over iron cities, the new prayer of medicine was whispered not in churches, but in laboratories. Let us understand so that we may heal. The rise of the modern doctor. By the dawn of the 20th century, the figure of the doctor had transformed. Once a wandering healer or alchemist, he now wore a white coat, a symbol of cleanliness, authority, and faith in science. Medical schools flourished. Anatomy, chemistry, and biology were no longer mysterious arts, but structured disciplines. The stethoscope, invented by René Laennec, became the emblem of trust. Patients came not for blessings, but for diagnosis. Hospitals expanded into cities of their own: wards, laboratories, operating theaters. Electric light replaced candlelight. Records were kept, procedures standardized. Medicine had entered its bureaucratic age. Yet the doctor's calling remained deeply human. In the trenches of World War I, physicians stitched torn flesh and calmed broken minds. They learned that healing was not only physical, but emotional. Back home, the image of the doctor became heroic. Posters showed him standing tall amid sickness, holding a lamp against darkness. He was the new priest of progress. But with fame came fatigue. Doctors began to face the burden of responsibility, the expectation to know everything, cure everything, save everyone. Some faltered, others innovated. By the 1920s, medicine had achieved miracles once thought divine: vaccines, antiseptics, X-rays. Yet the most profound transformation was invisible: the shift from faith to trust, from superstition to science, from helplessness to hope. The modern doctor had become a symbol of reason in a still unreasonable world. And as the century turned, his journey was only beginning.
When the guns of 1914 thundered across Europe, medicine entered a new kind of battlefield. The surgeon's scalpel was no longer confined to the quiet of hospitals. It now moved beneath the roar of artillery. Trenches became clinics, and mud became the operating table. In makeshift tents lit by lanterns, doctors fought their own war, not against nations, but against time, blood loss, and infection. The wounded arrived in waves, carried on stretchers slick with rain and fear. Here, triage was born. Doctors learned to choose who might live and who must be left. It was a grim arithmetic of mercy, one that turned compassion into discipline. New tools emerged from the carnage. The blood transfusion, once experimental, became routine. The ambulance, once a novelty, became an emblem of salvation. Anesthesia advanced in the mud. X-rays followed the soldiers, glowing like ghosts in the dark. But war also revealed the fragility of the human mind. Shell shock, the invisible wound, haunted soldiers who returned home trembling at every noise. The body could be sutured. The soul could not. The first psychiatrists of war found themselves treating memories rather than wounds. When peace finally came, medicine was changed forever. The battlefield had become a laboratory. Diseases had been cataloged, techniques refined, and a new generation of doctors had learned that healing was not only an art of precision, but of endurance. Then, scarcely 2 decades later, the world burned again. In the Second World War, medicine became industrial. Factories produced bandages, plasma, and penicillin by the ton.
plastic surgery found new purpose as faces were rebuilt from flame and shrapnel. Mobile surgical units followed the front lines, operating within hours of injury, a revolution in survival. Behind every victory was a surgeon's hand, trembling but steady. Behind every statistic was a human body, stitched and salvaged. When the war ended, the doctors who returned carried with them a new oath, not just to heal the wounded, but to prevent the wounds of civilization itself. The lessons written in blood would become the foundation of modern medicine's conscience. The doctor, once a servant of peace, had become a soldier of humanity. The age of penicillin. In 1928, a drop of mold changed the fate of the world. Alexander Fleming, peering into a forgotten petri dish, saw that the mold had killed the bacteria around it. He called it penicillin. The discovery seemed small, an accident of neglect, but history would remember it as the moment humanity gained the upper hand over infection. At first, few believed it mattered. The mold was delicate, hard to grow, and even harder to purify. Years passed before Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, and their team at Oxford found a way to make it practical. Then came war. Soldiers were dying not from bullets, but from pus and fever. The Allies poured resources into production. By 1944, penicillin flowed from factories like liquid salvation. A scratch that once meant death now meant recovery. The miracle spread beyond the battlefield. Civilian hospitals saw infections vanish that had plagued mankind for centuries. Pneumonia, syphilis, gangrene all bowed before the blue mold. But every miracle carries its shadow. The overuse of antibiotics would one day awaken resistant strains, microbes learning to fight back. Yet in the mid-20th century, no such doubts clouded the triumph. Humanity had conquered its oldest enemy, decay itself. Medicine entered its golden age. Laboratories replaced monasteries, test tubes replaced crucibles. The dream of the alchemists to transmute suffering into health had finally come true. The doctor now wielded not just the scalpel, but the power to cure. The mind unveiled. While medicine conquered the body, another frontier beckoned, the mind. In quiet Viennese rooms heavy with cigar smoke, Sigmund Freud listened to his patients speak of dreams and desire. He believed that beneath reason lay a restless ocean of the unconscious, shaping every thought and fear. Others followed, Jung, Adler, Klein, each mapping the invisible terrain of the psyche. For the first time, illness was not only of flesh, but of feeling. Depression, neurosis, hysteria, these were no longer sins or weaknesses, but conditions to be understood and treated. Hospitals built psychiatric wards, universities founded departments of psychology. Electroshock, insulin therapy, and even lobotomy were tried, crude tools for a vast mystery. Some cures were cruel, yet they marked the beginning of compassion for mental suffering. War had shown the cost of unseen wounds. Veterans trembled in their sleep, reliving the trenches. Civilians cracked under the weight of loss. Out of this collective trauma, psychiatry grew not as luxury, but necessity. By mid-century, new drugs, chlorpromazine, lithium, antidepressants offered chemical peace. The brain, once an enigma, began to yield to biochemistry. Still, the questions remained eternal. What is sanity? What is the self?
In every patient's story, doctors found a reflection of their own fragile humanity. The scalpel could no longer reach where healing was most needed. Words, empathy, and understanding became the new instruments of medicine. The mind, at last, had entered the clinic. The wars had ended, but the world remained wounded. In 1948, nations gathered to build not weapons, but hope. The World Health Organization was born, an idea as radical as any revolution, that health was a universal right, not a privilege. Vaccines marched across continents against smallpox, polio, measles. Mosquito nets followed, carrying the dream of eradicating malaria. In cities and villages, doctors became ambassadors of survival. Public health became a form of diplomacy. The epidemiologist replaced the explorer, tracing diseases instead of rivers. Laboratories became global observatories of life. Smallpox, the oldest killer of empires, fell in 1980. The first disease ever defeated by human hands. It was not conquest, but cooperation that won. Yet new plagues rose to take its place: HIV, Ebola, influenza. The world had grown closer, and so had its dangers. Airplanes carried both commerce and contagion. The doctor's duty was no longer local, it was planetary. Health had become the new measure of civilization. In 1953, two young scientists, James Watson and Francis Crick, glimpsed the spiral staircase of life itself, the double helix of DNA. Within its twisting ladder lay the secret code of existence, 4 letters spelling the grammar of creation. What alchemists had once sought in furnaces, biology now found in molecules. Soon, genes were mapped, cloned, and read. The cell became a library of instructions, and medicine became a language of editing and repair. Heredity was no longer fate, it was information. By the late 20th century, doctors could peer into the very code of disease. Cancer, once a shadow, revealed its molecular face. Inherited disorders could be traced, even prevented. The Human Genome Project, a vast collaboration of minds and machines, promised to decode humanity itself. But the new power came with ancient questions. If we could rewrite life, should we? Was healing a duty or a temptation? As the century closed, medicine stood again at the threshold of mystery, half science, half philosophy. The tools had changed, but the longing remained the same, to understand the essence of life, and through it, the meaning of being human. The age of genes was not an ending, but another transmutation in the long alchemy of healing. And so, from the smoky laboratories of the alchemists to the bright screens of geneticists, the story continued. One long experiment in mercy, one endless search for the secret of wholeness.
The atomic body. The 20th century's midpoint was an age of paradox, of healing and annihilation. The same atom that powered cities could erase them. When the mushroom clouds rose over Japan, doctors faced horrors no textbook had imagined. Skin melted like wax, bones glowed faintly beneath blistered flesh. Radiation sickness entered the medical lexicon, a disease born of progress itself. Yet from the same atomic power came revelation. Scientists learned that radiation could also heal, not just harm. Radiotherapy began to shrink tumors, turning destruction into precision. The X-ray,
once a curiosity, evolved into the CT scan, peeling back the body in layers of light. Hospitals became laboratories of physics. The stethoscope was joined by the Geiger counter. The physician became part physicist, part philosopher. But the atomic age changed more than the body. It altered the doctor's soul. It taught medicine humility before its own inventions. Humanity now held both cure and catastrophe in the same trembling hand. The body had become a field of energy, the self a constellation of particles. The old dream of transmutation had returned, this time not in gold, but in light. The electronic pulse. By the 1960s, medicine began to hum with electricity. Machines blinked, beeped, and breathed for the dying. The hospital filled with cables and code. The heart monitor watched every beat. The ventilator whispered air into still lungs. Surgeons operated while screens glowed like stained glass. The line between life and death was no longer a moment, it was a signal. With the rise of cardiac surgery, dialysis, and organ transplantation, medicine became mechanical as much as biological. The body was seen as a system, its parts replaceable, its rhythms programmable. Then came computers. Doctors began to store records in bits and bytes. Diagnosis met data. Machines learned to see patterns that human eyes missed. But behind every flicker of progress lay the same ancient question. When does healing become control? When machines sustain life beyond suffering, what does mercy mean? The electronic pulse connected every heartbeat to the grid of knowledge. Medicine had gained a new language, digital, precise, tireless. Yet the patient's voice still trembled in the static, reminding the world that healing was not code, but compassion. The age of the mind's mirror. As machines learned to read the body, doctors turned again toward the mind. The mid-20th century saw the rise of psychiatry's second revolution, from couches to chemicals, from talk to neurotransmitters. Serotonin, dopamine, endorphins, the invisible messengers of mood were discovered. Pills replaced confession. Yet psychology did not fade, it evolved. Carl Rogers and Viktor Frankl spoke of meaning, empathy, and choice. In asylums turned hospitals, patients were no longer inmates, but participants in their own healing. Technology followed thought. EEGs mapped the mind's storms. CT and MRI scanners revealed its architecture. The brain became both a machine and a mystery, a blowing cathedral of impulses. By the century's end, neuroscience had become the new frontier. Memory could be traced. Fear could be mapped. Personality could be visualized. But the mirror cut both ways. To see the mind was also to expose it. The doctor had to become a guardian of dignity, not merely a decoder of thought. The human spirit, once the most elusive element of medicine, was now under the microscope. And yet the closer science came to the brain, the deeper its wonder grew.
The global vaccine. In 1955, children lined up in schoolyards, sleeves rolled and hearts steady. The polio vaccine, developed by Jonas Salk, was a triumph of hope over fear. Parents wept as their children walked home, safe from the paralysis that had haunted generations. Vaccination became the new faith of modernity, a covenant between science and society. Sabin's oral vaccine followed, spreading immunity through sugar cubes and smiles. As decades passed, vaccines multiplied against measles, tetanus, rubella, hepatitis. Medicine no longer waited for disease to strike. It met the enemy in advance. In poor nations, mobile clinics carried coolers of vials through deserts and jungles. The doctor became a traveler again, as in the days of Paracelsus, this time armed not with herbs, but with cold storage and conviction. Then came the pandemics, HIV, SARS, Ebola, and in the 21st century, COVID-19. The world learned again how fragile it was, how connected every breath could be. Science responded with unprecedented speed, sequencing genomes, crafting vaccines in months, not years. The syringe became both symbol and salvation. Through it all, one truth endured: prevention was the purest form of healing. The code of life. At the dawn of the new millennium, medicine became digital at its core. The Human Genome Project finished its map, 3 billion letters long, the autobiography of our species. With that map came new powers. Doctors could read predispositions before symptoms appeared. Genetic counseling, stem cell therapy, and cloning experiments challenged the boundaries of creation. Diseases once thought incurable began to bend under precision medicine. Cancer treatments targeted single mutations. CRISPR allowed scientists to edit the very script of life. The doctor's library now included the patient's DNA. Healing became prediction. The waiting room became a data center. But new dilemmas arose: privacy, inequality, the ethics of perfection. Could humanity survive its own control over evolution? The laboratory, once a place of curiosity, had become a stage for moral reckoning. The physician of the 21st century stood not just beside the sickbed, but at the edge of creation. The line between healing and redesign had blurred. Medicine was no longer content to cure. It sought to rewrite what it meant to be human. The machine healer. By the 2020s, medicine entered its most audacious experiment, teaching machines to heal. Artificial intelligence began reading scans faster than radiologists, predicting heart attacks before symptoms, suggesting treatments from oceans of data. Robotic surgeons cut with superhuman steadiness. Virtual consultations crossed continents in seconds. The doctor's office became the cloud. Diagnosis came from algorithms trained on millions of lives. Hospitals turned into networks. Patients carried their medical histories in their pockets. And yet, the art of healing could not be automated. A machine could identify illness, but not sorrow. It could prescribe, but not comfort. The new doctor learned to work alongside intelligence, both human and artificial, to wield data with empathy and precision with humility. In this fusion of silicon and flesh, medicine rediscovered its oldest purpose: to understand the living, not merely to repair them. The age of AI was not the end of medicine, but its newest transmutation. From the philosopher's stone to the quantum chip, the quest had always been the same: to turn ignorance into insight and pain into meaning.
Medicine beyond Earth. In the 21st century's later decades, humanity looked upward again, not to the heavens for miracles, but for missions. Medicine followed the astronauts. Space revealed a new anatomy. Bones weakened without gravity, hearts reshaped, immune systems dulled by radiation and isolation. The human body, evolved for Earth, began to falter among the stars. Doctors became biomedical engineers of the cosmos. They studied muscle loss in orbit, fluid shifts in the blood, and the strange dreams of zero gravity.
On the International Space Station, every heartbeat became data, every symptom a lesson in adaptation. When astronauts returned, their bones told stories of fragility and resilience. Medicine learned from them how deeply life was tied to gravity and how courage could bend biology. Then came the plans for Mars. Clinics were designed for red dust and silence. Surgeons trained to operate with robots as their hands and Earth as their audience. In space, there would be no hospital, no emergency room, only knowledge, trust, and improvisation. The frontier of health had become cosmic. For the first time, medicine faced its oldest question in a new light. What does it mean to heal when home itself is millions of miles away? The ageless body. Back on Earth, another revolution was unfolding, not in rockets, but in cells. As populations aged, scientists turned their gaze toward time itself. Could aging be slowed or even reversed? Telomeres, mitochondria, stem cells, each became part of a new grammar of longevity. Laboratories tested compounds that mimicked fasting, drugs that rejuvenated cells, therapies that edited senescent DNA. Biogerontology became a science of hope and hubris alike. The old dream of immortality, once whispered by alchemists, reappeared in white coats and clean rooms. Billionaires funded projects to defeat death. Cryogenic vaults promised to keep the dead waiting for the future's mercy. But as lifespans lengthened, ethics grew heavy. What happens to a world where death retreats? Can meaning survive if time has no edge? Doctors found themselves as philosophers once more, guardians not only of life, but of its balance. They learned that longevity without purpose is another form of illness. In the end, perhaps the goal was not to live forever, but to live wisely, to keep the flame of vitality burning even as the candle of existence grows thin. The ethics of power. By the mid-21st century, medicine had achieved what kings once prayed for, the power to design life. Gene editing, synthetic organs, neural implants, designer embryos, each promised salvation, yet whispered temptation. Parents could now choose eye color, intelligence, disease resistance. Surgeons could rebuild faces, replace hearts, erase memories. But every breakthrough divided the world further, between those who could afford perfection and those who could not. Health became a currency, and morality its market. Hospitals convened bioethics boards, philosophers joined medical rounds. What was the limit of healing before it became hubris? Was a body enhanced still human? Was a clone still an individual? Doctors who once battled death now debated identity. They realized that the greatest frontier was not the gene or the brain, but the soul, the unseen contract between freedom and restraint. In these debates, medicine rediscovered humility. Power without wisdom was a kind of disease. The future demanded not only innovation, but